and I have prayed to God for understanding. But even now, at 85 years old, with the chill of my final winter settling deep into my bones, there is one ghost I cannot forgive. The one who lives in the little blue house at the end of Sycamore Lane. They see a woman stooped with age, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hair as white as cotton. They see a quiet, gentle soul. They do not see the 16-year-old girl who still lives inside me, the girl who learned the terrible weight of justice not in a courtroom, but in the heart of a raging fire. My story does not begin with that fire, though. No, it begins with warmth. It begins in a small, two-room cabin nestled in a West Virginia hollow, so deep in the mountains that the sun had to fight its way over the ridges each morning. The year was 1954. I was 16, and the world was made of three things: my mother, Josephine, my little sister, Catherine, and the love that held our tiny world together. We did not have much. The floorboards of our cabin were worn smooth by generations of tired feet, and the wind had a way of whistling through the chinks in the walls, no matter how much newspaper Mama and I stuffed in them. Our father, Benjamin Parker, was a ghost in our lives. A faded photograph on the mantelpiece. He had left to find work in the coal mines before I was born, and like so many men of that time and place, he was simply swallowed by the world, never to return. Mama never spoke ill of him. She would just look at his picture, a sad, soft smile on her lips, and say, "He was a man with big dreams, Tess." Sometimes the world is not big enough for a man's dreams. So it was just the three of us. Mama was the sun we all orbited. She was a slip of a woman, but she had a strength in her that could shame an ox. She worked from before sunrise to long after sunset, cleaning the house of the mine supervisor up on the hill, taking in laundry, tending our little garden patch. Her hands were always rough, her back always aching, but her spirit was never bent. She believed in two things with all her heart: hard work and the power of a good education. "I might only be able to give you calluses on your hands, Tess," she would tell me, her voice gentle but firm as she stitched a patch onto my worn dress, "but I can give you dreams in your head. You read your books. You get your learning. You will not spend your life scrubbing other people's floors." And I did. I loved school. I loved the smell of old paper and chalk dust. I loved the way words could build worlds right there in my mind. But what I loved most was coming home to my little sister, Cassie. She was 9 years old then, 7 years my junior. A little bird of a girl with eyes the color of a summer sky and a laugh that could make the wildflowers jealous. She was my shadow, my confidant, my whole heart. Our evenings were our sacred time. After a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Mama would sit in her rocking chair, her Bible in her lap, while I taught Cassie the thing our family did best: quilting. It was more than a craft to us. This faded floral was from my first real dress for the church picnic. As our needles flew, we were not just stitching cloth, we were stitching our lives together, creating a tapestry of love and memory, a warm, sturdy blanket to protect us from the cold world outside. I remember one afternoon in particular. It was October, and the mountains were on fire with color, all reds and golds and oranges. A crispness was in the air, a promise of the winter to come. I was showing Cassie a new stitch, a little star pattern. I pulled her onto my lap and kissed the top of her head. "It is all right, little bird," I whispered, wrapping her finger in a piece of clean cloth. "Sometimes you think it is the very air you breathe, something that will always be there. You do not understand how fragile it is, how one cruel gust of wind can blow it all away, leaving you gasping in a vacuum." I did not know, as I held my sister in my arms that golden afternoon, that it was the last perfect day of our childhood. I did not know that the sun was setting on our little world, and a long, dark night was about to begin. The star pattern she was learning remained unfinished, a silent prophecy on a square of cotton. Broadett himself. He was a gangly boy of about my age, and he stood twisting his cap in his hands on our doorstep, his face pale and his eyes unable to meet mine. I had just come in from the well, the buckets of water sloshing against my legs, and Cassie was right behind me, chattering away about a rabbit she had seen. "Tess," he started, his voice cracking. But they were hollow, meaningless. My mother, the strongest person I knew, the sun of my universe, was gone.
Just like that.
A flame snuffed out. I remember standing there, the water bucket still in my hands, the cold seeping into my fingers, and I could not feel a thing. It was Cassie who broke the silence. She let out a small, wounded cry, the sound a baby animal makes, and buried her face in my skirt. That sound, that tiny, desperate sound, is what finally broke through the numbness. It pierced my heart and let the agony flood in. Sharp point of focus. Cassie. She had not spoken a word since Mr. Henderson left. She just clung to my hand, her small body trembling, her sky-blue eyes wide with a terror I could not soothe. The funeral was held in the small white chapel at the bottom of the hollow. It was a gray, drizzling day that matched the color of my soul. I sat in the front pew, wearing a black dress a neighbor had loaned me, holding Cassie's hand so tightly my knuckles were white. I watched them lower the simple pine box into the ground. I felt the cold, damp earth on my knees. But I did not cry. It felt as if all the tears in my body had frozen solid. Crying was a luxury, and I was no longer a child who could afford luxuries. I was 16 years old, and I was a mother now. After the last of the mourners had drifted away, leaving us standing by the fresh mound of dirt, a figure emerged from the mist. He was a tall, not since I was a little girl, but I knew who he was. "Jeremiah Blackwood," I said, my voice flat. He nodded once, his gaze flicking from me to the new grave, then to Cassie, who shrank behind me. "Your mother was a stubborn woman," he said. It was not a eulogy. It was a statement of fact. This was our grandfather, my mother's father. He had disowned her when she became pregnant with me out of wedlock. He was a man who lived by a rigid, unforgiving code, and in his eyes, his daughter had brought shame upon his name. He had never once acknowledged my existence. He had never met Cassie. He was a stranger to us, bound only by blood he had long since tried to wash his hands of. "You will come live with me," he announced. It was not an invitation. It was a command. "Pack your things. I will be back in an hour." A flicker of something, was it hope? Relief? Dared to spark within me. We would have a roof over our heads. We would not be sent to an orphanage. But one look at his face extinguished that spark completely. There was no kindness in his eyes, no grandfatherly affection. There was only the cold, hard calculation of a man assessing a tool. He was not taking us in because he loved us. He was a widower who lived alone. He needed a housekeeper. He needed a farmhand. And he had just inherited too. As we walked away from our mother's grave, leaving her to the cold and the quiet, I held Cassie's hand and made a silent promise. I would protect her. I would be her mother, her father, her entire world. I would stand between her and any darkness that tried to touch her. It was a vow made in the ignorance of youth, with no understanding of the true nature of the darkness we were about to face. I thought I was walking towards a new, difficult life. I did not realize I was walking into the wolf's den, leading my little lamb right behind me. Jeremiah Blackwood's house was a world away from the home we had lost. While our little cabin had been cramped and poor, it had been filled with the light of my mother's love. Jeremiah's house was larger, a sturdy, 2-story wooden farmhouse, but it was filled with a palpable silence, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It smelled of dust, old wood, and the faint, sour scent of stale whiskey. There were no quilts on the beds, no pictures on the walls, no sign that love had ever lived there. It was a house, not a home. Our lives changed overnight. The rhythm of our days was no longer set by school bells and quilting bees. I scrubbed the floors, washed the laundry by hand with harsh lye soap that chapped my skin raw, tended the vegetable garden, and prepared the evening meal. Every muscle in my body ached. She was tasked with collecting eggs, keeping the woodbox filled, and weeding the garden. The light that had once danced in her eyes was dimming, replaced by a guarded watchfulness. She did her chores quietly and efficiently, her small face set in a serious, worried expression that did not belong on a child. The laughter that used to bubble out of her was gone, trapped somewhere deep inside. Our grandfather. I could never bring myself to call him that, even in my own mind. He was always just he or Jeremiah. Rarely spoke to either of us. He would issue orders in a low grunt, and we would scurry to obey. The only time he seemed to find his voice was at night. After supper, he would sit in his armchair by the cold hearth, a bottle of cheap, clear moonshine at his side. As he drank, a darkness would uncoil within him. Sometimes he would mutter to himself long, rambling complaints about the weather, the government, the price of feed. And sometimes he would talk about my mother. He would call her foolish, proud, a sinner who had gotten what she deserved. I would sit at the kitchen table, pretending to mend a shirt, my back rigid, my hands clenched into fists in my lap. Every word was a lash against my raw heart. I wanted to scream at him, to defend my mother's memory. But I was a prisoner in his house, entirely dependent on his charity, a charity he made us pay for with every waking moment. My only defense was to build a wall of silence around myself and Cassie, to try and shield her from the venom that dripped from his tongue. The nights were the worst. I would lie awake in our small bed, Cassie's warm body curled against mine, and listen. I would listen to the creak of the floorboards as he stumbled to bed. I would listen to the mournful sigh of the wind outside. I would listen to the frantic beating of my own heart. This was not a life. It was a kind of suspended animation awaiting game. But what was I waiting for? I did not know. I only knew that fear had become a constant companion, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach that never went away. Have you ever lived in a silence that was louder than any scream? A silence filled with things unsaid, with threats unspoken? That was the silence of Jeremiah Blackwood's house. I tried to keep a spark of our old life alive for Cassie. In the precious few moments we had to ourselves, usually while mending clothes by the light of a single kerosene lamp, I would tell her stories. I would tell her about Mama, about her kindness and her laugh. I would tell her about our little cabin and the quilts we made. I would try to paint a world for her that was not this gray, cold reality. But it was like trying to grow flowers in frozen ground. She would listen, her eyes wide and sad, but she would not speak. She was retreating further and further into herself, into a silent, secret world where I could not follow. One night, about 3 months after we had arrived, a terrible storm rolled in. The rain came down in sheets, lashing against the windows, and the wind howled like a hungry animal. The power, dancing shadows on the walls. Jeremiah had been drinking more heavily than usual. He sat slumped in his chair, the nearly empty bottle of moonshine clutched in his hand, his eyes glassy and unfocused. I finished cleaning the kitchen, my movements quick and quiet, wanting nothing more than to escape to the relative safety of my room. "Girl," he slurred, his voice thick. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. "Yes, sir?" He did not look at me. His gaze was fixed on Cassie, who was huddled on a small rug by the door, trying to make herself invisible. "The little one," he said, a strange, predatory smile twisting his lips. "She's a quiet one. Pretty. Like her grandmother was." A cold dread, sharper and more terrifying than anything I had ever felt, pierced through me. I reached for Cassie's hand. It was ice cold. He grunted and pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. The chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. He took a step towards us, his shadow looming huge and monstrous on the wall behind him. "I say when you go to bed," he snarled. He reached out a hand, not for me, but for Cassie. Something inside me snapped. The fear did not vanish, but it was consumed by a hot, white rage. I was no longer a scared 16-year-old girl. I was a mother bear defending her cub. I pushed Cassie behind me with one arm and stood my ground. "You will not touch her," I said, and the voice that came out of me was low and dangerous, a voice I did not recognize as my own. In the chest. He was drunk and unsteady, and the push sent him stumbling backward. He tripped over the leg of his chair and went down with a crash, the whiskey bottle shattering on the floor. He roared with fury, a wordless sound of outrage, and started to push himself up. In that split second, I saw my chance. The kerosene lamp was on the small table beside me. I snatched it up, the hot glass searing my palm. I held it high, the flame flickering wildly. "You stay away from her," I hissed, the words torn from the deepest part of my soul. "You stay away from both of us. Or, I swear to God Almighty, I will burn this house to the ground with you in it." He froze, halfway to his feet, his eyes wide. For the first time he saw me. He saw not a child, not a servant, but a deadly threat. He stared at the lamp, at the wild look in my eyes, and for a long moment, the only sounds were the howling of the wind and our ragged breaths. Then, slowly, a look of cunning replaced the fury in his eyes. He sank back down to the floor, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Feisty," he muttered. "All right, girl. You win. For tonight." I did not lower the lamp. I backed away slowly, pulling Cassie with me, my eyes locked on his. We did not stop until we were inside our room, with the door bolted. I sank to the floor, whispering promises of safety that I did not know if I could keep. That night was a turning point. It was the night I realized that we were not just living in a cold and loveless house. We were living in a cage with a monster, and the monster was growing bolder. I had won the battle, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow, that I had not won the war. He would not forget what I had done. He would wait, and he would punish me for it in the cruelest way he knew how. From that moment on, I did not let Cassie out of my sight. She was my shadow, and I was her shield. But even the strongest shield cannot protect against a betrayal that comes in a moment of weakness. The wolf was in the fold, and he was just biding his time. The 2 weeks that followed that terrible night were a strange, tense truce. Jeremiah spoke to us even less than before, if that was possible. He would watch me, his gray eyes filled with a cold, calculating look, but he made no move. He drank his moonshine, ate his meals, and worked his fields. The house was thick with a silence that felt heavier and more threatening than his drunken rants ever had. I lived on a knife's edge of vigilance. I made sure Cassie was with me at all times. When I went to the barn, she came with me. When I worked in the garden, she sat on a stool at the end of a row. When I cooked, she sat at the kitchen table. I never let her be alone. Deceptively peaceful day. The water buckets were empty. The well was a good 100 yards from the house, down a slight slope. It was a task that required both my hands and all my strength. Jeremiah had left earlier than usual, heading to town to buy feed, or so he had said. The house was quiet. "You stay right here, little bird," I told Cassie, who was sitting at the table drawing on a piece of scrap paper with a charcoal nub. "I will be right back. Do not open the door for anyone. Just sit right there." She nodded, her eyes wide and serious. I looked at her, my sweet, silent sister, and my heart ached. She was a ghost of the girl she used to be. I wanted so desperately to see her laugh again, to hear her chatter about rabbits and wildflowers. Maybe, I thought to myself, just for a foolish moment, maybe the worst was over. Maybe my stand that night had taught him a lesson. The walk to the well and back could not have taken more than 5 minutes. I was strong, and I hurried, my bare feet flying over the familiar path. But as I approached the house, a sudden, sickening feeling washed over me. The front door was slightly ajar. I had closed it. I was sure I had. I dropped the buckets, water sloshing over my feet, and ran. I burst through the door, my heart pounding in my ears like a war drum. The kitchen was empty. The piece of paper and the charcoal were on the floor. "Cassie," I called out, my voice shrill with panic. A sound from upstairs. A small, muffled whimper. I do not remember my feet touching the stairs. I flew up them, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The door to his bedroom was closed. I threw it open, and the world ended. He was there. Jeremiah. He had not gone to town. He had waited, hidden somewhere, watching me leave. He had my sister, my sweet, 9-year-old Cassie. I will not describe what I saw. There are some images so vile, so soul-destroying, that they should not be given the dignity of words. They belong to the darkness from which they were born. The sight of her small, terrified face. I launched myself at him, my fingernails bared like claws. I was a wild animal, driven by nothing but the instinct to kill. I raked my nails down his face, and he howled in pain and surprise, shoving me away. I fell backward, hitting the wall hard. He used that moment to pull himself together and flee, scrambling out of the room and down the stairs, the coward that he was. I did not go after him. My entire universe had collapsed to the small, trembling figure on the bed. I crawled to her, my own body racked with sobs. "Cassie," I whispered, my voice breaking.
Oh.
"God, Cassie. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I gathered her into my arms. She was limp, her body small and fragile. But she was not crying. Her sky-blue eyes were open. The light I had been trying so desperately to protect had been extinguished completely. He had not just hurt her body. He had murdered her spirit. In that moment, something inside me changed forever. I dressed her in her cleanest nightgown. He did not return to the house that day or that night. I was grateful for that. I do not know what I would have done if he had. My grief and my rage were so immense. They felt like a physical presence in the room, a poison that choked the very air. I tried to tend to Cassie, using the folk remedies Mama had taught me. I brewed chamomile tea to calm her. And I was standing on the shore, helpless to pull her out. The days that followed were a living hell. Jeremiah eventually slunk back to the house for deep, bloody scratches on his face serving as a testament to his sin. He did not speak of what he had done. He did not have to. His crime hung in the air between us, a toxic fog. He avoided me. My focus was on Cassie, but it was like trying to nurture a plant whose roots had been severed.
She would not eat. She would not speak.
She flinched away from any touch. The only time she showed any reaction was at night, when the nightmares came. She would whimper and thrash in her sleep, her small body reliving a horror she could not name. I would hold her, whispering to her, trying to anchor her to the present, but it was useless. I knew then that I could not stay. I could not let her live under the same roof as the man who had broken her. Fleeing was no longer a vague idea. It was a burning, absolute necessity. But where could we go? We had no money, no family, no one. We were two young girls, one of them deeply wounded. Just running away into the woods was a death sentence. We needed a plan. We needed money. We needed a safe place to land. And so, as I held my broken sister in my arms, a new, cold purpose began to form in the ruins of my heart. I would not just save her. I would get justice for her. He had taken her laughter, her light, her childhood. I would take everything from him. If there was no justice to be found in the world of men or God, then I would create my own. And it would be as swift and as merciless as the evil he had committed. My grief hardened into a cold, sharp resolve. Every moment of every day became dedicated to a single purpose: escape and retribution. I started to watch Jeremiah, not with the eyes of a frightened girl, but with the detached focus of a predator studying its prey. I memorized his routines. He woke with the sun, worked until noon, ate his lunch, and then often napped for an hour in his chair, especially on hot days. He went to town every other Tuesday for supplies. He got drunk every single night, starting with his first glass of moonshine right after supper and finishing the bottle before he stumbled off to bed. His predictability was his weakness, and I planned to use it against him. I began to hoard what little money I could. On his trips to town, he would sometimes give me a few coins to buy thread or salt. Instead, I would use old thread or go without salt. And I would hide the coins in a loose floorboard under our bed. It was a pitifully small amount, not nearly enough for 2 bus tickets to anywhere, but it was a start. It was a seed of hope. My mind, however, kept circling around a darker solution. A permanent one. I knew where he kept the rat poison. It was a small, unassuming cardboard box on a high shelf in the barn, behind some old jars. He used it to keep the rats out of the corn feed. It was, I knew, a terrible and efficient killer. The thought took root in my mind like a noxious weed. It would be so simple. A little bit in his evening coffee, or stirred into his stew. It would be an end to our suffering.
An end to him.
It would be justice. One afternoon, while he was napping in his chair, his snores rattling the windows, I crept out to the barn. My heart was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. This is for Cassie, I told myself. This is the only way. My hands were shaking as I climbed the rickety ladder to the high shelf. I reached back, my fingers brushing against cobwebs and dust, until I found it. The small, square box. I held it in my hand. It felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained the weight of a human soul. This small box held the power of life and death, the power to end our torment forever. I stood there in the dusty, quiet barn, the smell of hay and manure in my nostrils, and I felt a profound and terrible sense of calm wash over me. This was the answer. I turned to climb down, the box clutched in my hand, and I saw her. Cassie was standing in the doorway of the barn, a silent, waif-like figure silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. She was just watching me, her eyes as empty and vast as the sky. It would only stain my own hands, my own soul, with a darkness that would rival his. I could not save her by becoming a monster myself. There had to be another way, a better way. I put the box back on the shelf, my whole body trembling with the aftermath of the decision. I climbed down and took Cassie's hand, leading her back to the house. As I put her to bed for a nap, a memory surfaced, a lifeline thrown to my drowning mind. The funeral. The kind, pitying faces of the church women. And one face in particular. Her name was Mrs. Matilda Albright. She was an elderly widow who lived alone in a neat little blue house at the very end of our road. At the funeral, while others had offered empty platitudes, her voice low and raspy. The world can be a cruel place for girls without a mother's protection. Then she had pressed a slip of paper into my palm. That is my address. My door is always open. He grunted his assent, caring little about Cassie's health as long as it did not inconvenience him. I dressed us in our best, worn-out church dresses, and we walked the half-mile to the little blue house. It stood out from the other drab, weathered houses on the road, a splash of cheerful color against the green and brown of the mountains. A garden full of late-blooming marigolds and zinnias surrounded it. It looked like a house where kindness lived. My heart was pounding with a mixture of terror and hope. I was about to confess a story of unspeakable horror to a near stranger. She could turn us away. She could call the sheriff. Matilda Albright stood before us. She was smaller than I remembered, a bird-boned woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. She looked at me, then down at the silent, fragile girl beside me, and her face softened with a knowing sadness. "I have been expecting you, child," she said, her voice gentle.
Come in. Coming out of the cold.
She led us not into a formal parlor, but into a warm, sunlit kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and baking bread. She sat us down at a small wooden table and placed a cup of warm milk in front of Cassie and a cup of strong, hot tea in front of me. She did not press me. She just sat with us. Her presence a comforting, patient silence until I was ready. And then the dam broke. The story came tumbling out of me, a torrent of pain, fear, and rage that I had held inside for so long. I told her everything. About my mother's death, about Jeremiah's coldness, about the work, about the drunken nights. My voice broke when I spoke of the storm, of the lamp, of my desperate, failed attempt to protect my sister. And when I got to the part about what had happened in his bedroom, I could no longer speak. A raw, ragged sob tore from my throat, and I buried my face in my hands, my body shaking with the force of my grief. I felt a hand on my shoulder, gnarled and warm. I looked up into Mrs. Albright's face. There was no shock there.
No pity.
Only a deep, profound, and terrible understanding. There were tears in her own eyes, ancient tears for a pain I suddenly realized she knew intimately. "He did the same to me," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a memory. "My uncle. When I was a girl. A little younger than your sister." She stared out the window, her eyes seeing a past that was 60 years gone but as fresh as yesterday. "No one helped me. My mother told me to be quiet, to not make trouble. The world looks away from the ugliness, child. It always has. It pretends not to see the monsters who live next door. Prayers are well and good, but they do not stop a wolf from tearing a lamb apart. Sometimes, when the world looks away, justice is a thing you have to make with your own 2 hands." And in that warm, sunlit kitchen, surrounded by the scent of cinnamon, Mrs. Matilda Albright, the kind, church-going widow, laid out a plan for murder. It was not a crime she proposed, but an act of what she called unholy justice. A cleansing. "He cannot be allowed to harm another soul," she said, her voice low and steady. "He is a rot,
A disease.
and the only cure for a rot is to burn it out." Her plan was both simple and terrifying. She had a special herbal concoction, she explained, a mixture of roots and flowers. I was to give it to him in his nightly bottle of moonshine. Once he was insensible, I was to place a lit kerosene lamp on the windowsill as a signal. She would see it from her house down the road. She would then take care of the rest. "A tragic accident," she said, her eyes boring into mine. "An old man, drunk, falls asleep with a lit cigarette or knocks over a lamp. It happens all the time. Nieces from a distant city whose parents had died. No one would question the kind, grieving widow taking in 2 orphan girls." I looked at Cassie. Was I trading one monster for another?
No.
I looked into her eyes and I saw not a monster, but a survivor. A woman who had been failed by the world and had spent a lifetime waiting for a chance to balance the scales. She was not offering me vengeance. She was offering me a future for my sister.
When?
I asked, my voice a whisper. "Tonight," she said, leaving no room for argument. She went to a cupboard and came back with a small, dark blue bottle filled with an oily, dark liquid. "Give him a good supper. Make sure he has plenty of his poison moonshine to drink. When he is good and drunk, when he is starting to doze in his chair, get a fresh bottle. Pour this entire thing into it. Make sure he drinks from it. Then, set the lamp in the window and come here.
Do not look back.
Just come straight here." Or a warning. I did not know which. I only knew that the girl who had walked to the blue house full of fear was gone. The woman walking back was an executioner. That evening felt like a dream. A slow-motion play where I was both an actor and a spectator. I moved with a calm, deliberate purpose that felt utterly alien. I cooked Jeremiah's favorite meal, fried chicken. Mashed potatoes with gravy and green beans cooked with bacon. It felt like I was preparing a Last Supper. He ate greedily, grunting his approval, completely oblivious to the storm gathering under his own roof. As he ate, I made sure his glass of moonshine was never empty. He drank it down, pouring another and then another. I watched him, my face a carefully constructed mask of servitude, while inside, my heart hammered against my ribs. I sent Cassie to our room early, telling her to get into bed and cover her head with her pillow. His snores filling the silent house. The bottle beside him was nearly empty. Now was the time. My hands did not shake as I went to the pantry and got a fresh, unopened bottle of his clear, foul-smelling whiskey. My movements were fluid, precise. I uncorked it. I took the small blue bottle from my pocket. I did not hesitate. I poured the entire contents, the dark, viscous liquid, into the moonshine. I swirled it once and put the cork back in. I walked back into the main room and placed the new bottle on the table beside his chair. "Jeremiah," I said, my voice steady. "You finished your bottle. Here is a new one." He stirred, his eyes struggling to focus. He saw the new bottle and a greedy smile spread across his face. "Good girl," he slurred. He fumbled with the cork, pulled it out, and took a long, deep swallow directly from the bottle. He took another.
And a third.
Then he sighed, a long, rattling sound, and his body went limp. His head fell back against the chair, his mouth hanging open. His breathing became deep, slow, and unnervingly regular. I called his name. I shook his shoulder. Nothing. He was gone from the world, sunk into a chemical slumber so deep it was almost indistinguishable from death itself. My own breath hitched in my throat. It was done. The first part, my part, was done. I moved to the front window, but with the immense, terrible weight of what I was doing. I was holding a star, a signal for an angel of vengeance. I took a deep breath and placed the lamp on the center of the windowsill. Then I turned, without a backward glance, and went to my room. I gathered a sleeping Cassie into my arms, wrapping her in our most precious possession, the quilt we had been making with our mother. I carried her out the back door, into the cool night air. We did not take anything else. We were leaving the ghosts behind. We hurried down the dark road, my sister a warm, heavy weight in my arms. I did not run. I walked with a steady, determined pace. I did not look back. I would not let myself. But you do not need to see a thing like that to know it is happening. First, there was a sound, a low whoosh, like a giant's breath. And then, the sky behind us began to glow. A flickering, orange light that grew brighter and brighter, casting our shadows long on the road ahead of us. It painted the trees in demonic colors. I could feel the heat on my back, even from that distance. Then came the roar, the sound of old, dry timber surrendering to the ravenous hunger of the flames. Cassie stirred in my arms. "What is that noise, Tess?" she whispered, her voice sleepy, the first words she had spoken in weeks. I pulled the quilt tighter around her, shielding her face from the terrible light behind us. "It is just thunder, little bird," I said, my voice choked with unshed tears. "A summer storm. Go back to sleep. We are almost home." And for the first time in a long time, I was not lying. We were. As the flames consumed our past, we were walking towards the only home we had left. We were walking towards the little blue house. The investigation was short and perfunctory. A formality. The county sheriff, a portly man named Miller with a weary face, came by Mrs. Albright's house the next morning. He took off his hat and accepted a cup of coffee, his eyes full of a tired sort of pity for the two newly orphaned girls sitting at the kitchen table. Mrs. Albright was a masterful actress. Her face was a mask of sorrow and neighborly concern. She told the sheriff how I had come knocking on her door in the middle of the night, frantic, with a feverish Cassie in my arms. She had taken us in, of course, the poor dears. She had been up with us all night, tending to the little one. They had not heard or seen a thing until the neighbors raised the alarm about the fire. "It is a terrible tragedy," she said, shaking her head slowly, dabbing at her dry eyes with a handkerchief. "But if I am being honest, Sheriff, not a surprising one. Jeremiah, well, he had a fondness for the bottle. We all knew it. It was only a matter of time before he got careless with a lamp or a cigarette." The sheriff nodded, sipping his coffee. "That is what it looks like," he agreed. "Found what was left of a bottle right next to his chair. Tragic, indeed. The man fell into a drunken sleep and never woke up." He looked at me, his expression softening. "What will you girls do now?" Before I could answer, Mrs. Albright placed a protective hand on my shoulder. "They will stay with me, of course," she declared, her voice firm, leaving no room for debate. "They are my kin now. I will look after them. It is what their dear mother, Josephine, would have wanted." And just like that, it was over. The official story was written and filed away. Jeremiah Blackwood's death was ruled an accident, a tragic consequence of a lonely man's addiction. No one looked any deeper. Why would they? The world had looked away from him when he was a monster. It was not about to look too closely now that he was ash. We were safe. The days that followed were like waking from a long, brutal nightmare. Mrs. Albright's blue house became our sanctuary. It was a place of quiet, of warmth, of healing. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the constant weight of fear on my chest. Albright's unwavering kindness and my constant, gentle presence, The little girl I thought I had lost began to slowly, tentatively return. It started small. A week after the fire, she spoke another sentence. A month later, I heard her hum a little tune while she was helping me shell peas in the garden. And then one day, about 6 months after we had come to live in the blue house, I saw a monarch butterfly land on a marigold. "Look, Tess," she said, a genuine, radiant smile spreading across her face. "Is it not beautiful?" I burst into tears. They were not tears of sorrow or of guilt, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. Her smile was the sun rising after the longest. Albright, or Grandma Tilly, as she insisted we call her, became the grandmother we never had. She was a woman of deep and practical wisdom. She taught me more about healing than any doctor could. She taught me about herbs and poultices, yes, but she also taught me about healing the soul. "Some wounds are too deep for medicine, Tess," she told me one afternoon as we sat on her porch quilting. "Some wounds can only be healed with patience, with love, and by stitching a new life, piece by piece, to cover the old scars." And that is what we did. I poured myself into my quilting, the art my mother had taught me. The needle in my hand was no longer a weapon or a tool of mending. It became an artist's brush. I stitched the colors of the mountains, the sorrow of our past, and the bright, fierce hope of our future into my quilts. They became my story, my confession, my prayer. People started to notice. They began buying my quilts, first from a stall at the county fair, then by commission. They called me Tess of the Quilts, a name that would follow me for the rest of my life. I had found my calling, not as a housekeeper or a servant, but as an artist. Cassie blossomed. She devoured her school books, fulfilling the dream our mother had once held for me. The silence that had once imprisoned her was replaced by a sharp, inquisitive mind and a gentle, compassionate heart. She went to college, became a teacher, and dedicated her life to helping children, especially those from troubled homes. She saw the ones the world looked away from, and she did not turn her back. She became the woman our mother would have been so proud of. Grandma Tilly lived to a ripe old age. She passed away peacefully in her sleep when I was 31 years old, leaving the little blue house and all her worldly wisdom to Cassie and me. We buried her in the churchyard, next to my mother, uniting our two families in death as they had been in life. Now I am 85 years old. Cassie, my sweet little sister, passed on 3 years ago from a peaceful heart, leaving a legacy of hundreds of students whose lives she touched. I am alone now, the last keeper of our story, living out my days in this same blue house, surrounded by the ghosts of the women who saved me. My hands are gnarled with arthritis, but they can still guide a needle. My quilts hang in galleries and in the homes of people who know nothing of the fire and the fury that created them. They see only the beauty, not the ashes from which it grew. I have had a good life, a full life, a life of peace and purpose, and I do not regret what I did. Not for 1 second. Do I believe in God? Yes, I do. And I believe that God knows the difference between wickedness and justice. The Bible says, "The Lord works righteousness and justice for all who are oppressed." Sometimes I think He just needs a human hand to help get the job done. What we did that night was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of profound, desperate love. It was the only way to save my sister's soul and to honor the memory of my mother. It was a choice to not let evil have the final word. Life can break you. It can shatter you into 1,000 pieces. But it is always your choice whether you stay broken on the floor or pick up those pieces and stitch them back together into something new, something stronger, something beautiful. Living in a silent house with a monster. And I need her to know that she is not alone, that there is a way out, that a future exists beyond the pain, and that sometimes the most courageous act of all is to light a fire and walk away, not looking back, towards a new dawn.